Okay, so grit, persistence that pays off. So the overview of what we'll look at today, what in fact is grit. It's defined here in the first bullet on the left as passion and persistence for long-term goals. And this whole theory and sort of movement was developed by Dr. Angela Duckworth, who we'll look at in a little bit. Obviously, she needs to be given the majority of credit here for developing this theory and this movement. Second bullet, in terms of what grit is, it is in fact a predictor of success, and this is based on research. So all the work that somebody puts in to persevere, to in terms of their work ethic, their stamina to complete things, it leads to success. And what's interesting too is it leads to success, and it's the strongest predictor rather than intelligence or ability. So we are not a blank slate. The interesting point. And then the idea of grit development, that is something where, as I said, we're not a blank slate. We can continue to develop. Nothing is static. Effort has to be put in, but there's a number of things that can go our way if we put that time in. The second section, we'll look at keys to grit. So what are the keys? In fact, we will look at those. Second portion of this presentation and this theory is growth mindset. This is from Dr. Carol Dweck. She developed the idea that being open to things like failure and seeing them as opportunities to learn and not as an end all be all. I will share with you the self-assessment grit quiz. You can take that while we're in this webinar. I will share the link via chat. And then, as I sort of intimated before, failure and success, how they're sort of tied to one another, and sort of reframing failure is not necessarily the negative thing, but the first bullet sort of suggests here too, be open to new pathways. The second bullet we'll look at in that section is avoiding thinking traps. Many of those will be familiar to you. And then finally, we'll look at strength in vulnerability, which I think is fascinating because vulnerability is as we all know, it's a very uncomfortable position to be in, but there is strength to be gained when in that position, depending upon your mindset. So Dr. Angela Duckworth, she is the founder of what we're calling grit. Again, the definition there is passion and persistence for long-term goals. So Angela has done considerable research. She's been published. She's got her doctorate. This is all legit. I did view this TED Talk. I recommend you check it out at some point. It's only 6 minutes long. We're not going to watch it here, just simply the nature of it. It's so brief. It's something that you guys can check out. But she does, in a nutshell, talk about how this is a mindset that can put us in a place that leads us to success, regardless of innate ability, regardless of intelligence, whether that be IQ or social intelligence. It's really something to push through. And basically that's, in a nutshell, what grit boils down to. So looking at what is grit, the first piece there is it is a predictor of success. So Dr. Duckworth and Dr. Willingham's research in 2016 suggests that grit, which is closely related to what many of us might call follow through. So following through on something we start and completing it leads to the following. So the first bullet looks at higher levels of academic success and likelihood of college graduation. They actually looked at college graduates, did a study and figured out who is really going to persevere in the face of all the academic rigor and eventually graduate, and those folks possessed grit. Second bullet, effort can trump talent. So the point there is, somebody might have a ton of talent, and I'm sure we know plenty of people who have a ton of talent but don't develop it. So effort has to be applied in order for these things to flourish. Natural talent isn't the greatest indicator of success. I think that's important to recognize, because we may not all have the same gifts, I think, right? But that does not put us in a hole. And then finally on the left, that bullet, skill times effort equals achievement. So we may have a natural talent wherever that baseline is, as long as we work on that skill and that effort sort of piggybacks on that piece, that's where the achievement piece comes in, whether it's in our personal lives or our professional lives. Grit development. There are 4 pieces there. The first is purpose, and this can be tough for many of us, figuring out what we love, what we really get lost in, the things that are intrinsically meaningful to us. If we can figure those things out and apply ourselves, grit can take us to considerable heights. Practice. I put failures into quote throughout this presentation because I think quotes sort of suggest that things are questionable, like they're really not relevant, or they might be false. So failure in its traditional definition, like, I lost, I'm awful, I'm a loser. Those sort of things don't apply to this theory. So failure is viewed as a part of practice. So to reframe that, it can be helpful. The third piece, hope. Challenges are an opportunity to learn. So when we know we come up against something that's really difficult, hope oftentimes can be lessened. Its impact is diminished, but seeing challenges and possible failures as opportunities and challenges to learn, that can put us in a greater light. And then finally, time. So grit, we have an idea of what it has to be and how to get it, but it doesn't come automatically. It is something we have to develop over time through purpose and practice, and we have to be patient with this too. Of course, change can be uncomfortable. So the keys to grit. This is super cool. So I learned about this while researching this subject to do this presentation. Keystone habits. Now we all know what habits are. We know what routines are. We all have them, good or bad. But this individual, Charles Duhigg, he wrote The Power of Habit, published in 2012, and he coined the term keystone habits. So what are these? And they're central to grit. These are the most important habits we develop. And I love the second one. They lead to multiple positive behaviors and have a ripple effect on other habits. So if I have a keystone habit, say it's exercise, and research has shown that exercise is one of the keystone habits. If we exercise 3 or more times a week, there's a ripple effect, a domino effect that affects the rest of our other habits. So the first habit that tends to come along after exercise is eating. So people who exercise 3 or more times a week really tend to watch what they eat. The research had shown those who keep a food journal lost twice as much weight as those who did not. So there's the follow through piece. Third bullet, keystone habits spark the chain reactions that help other good habits take hold. Another keystone habit is what they're calling a morning routine. So planning to plan. So when we get up, have an idea for the day so that we're proactive rather than reactive to the events that come along. So we set ourselves up and our time and sort of govern our own time as a way to present ourselves to the day and not sort of get in the back seat, but be the driver. Fourth piece, in terms of keystone habits, willpower is viewed as the most important keystone habit. It's central to developing grit. This is not news to us, right? So willpower is completely, it's the backbone to our habits, and it's the backbone in that case to developing grit. So it's a hard thing, especially when we looked at earlier, starting something that's really difficult, whether it's a job search, whether it's finishing a research paper. All of these things can diminish our willpower if we're not in the right mindset. Another key to grit, making adjustments to achieve goals. So again, with the growth mindset, which we'll look at in a little bit, the same thing with goals. We have to be able to amend them over time. And some of you might remember that acronym there. SMART. So what is that? Specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time bound. So using that sort of acronym to develop your goals and adjust them is key to developing grit, sort of accomplishing these things. The right hand column, practicing vulnerability and embracing failure. This sort of scares me, to practice vulnerability, to literally put yourself in a position that allows you to be viewed as, say, weak, viewed as somebody who might be failing something in the traditional sense. But with grit, it's okay to fail. It's okay to be vulnerable because you see it as a learning experience. Again, perhaps the most uncomfortable of all the keys is being vulnerable. Knowing when to ask for help. Most of us know when to ask for help, but the second piece there is it's not enough to know. We do have to ask for help. One of the hallmarks of gritty people, those who've developed it and continue to, they ask questions. They're not afraid to be, there's the vulnerable piece. Look, I don't know what's going on. I need to ask a question. I feel vulnerable. Boom, get out there, ask the questions. Don't overestimate talent. And we sort of looked at this a little bit in the beginning. So nice little bullet there is grit is greater than talent or intelligence, especially when effort has been involved. So it doesn't necessarily matter what we've been naturally given. It's up to us to develop these things. Yeah, interesting. Cultivate and subscribe to a growth mindset. That's what we'll look at next. And again, that's Dr. Carol Dweck. Her research in 2006, she founded and developed this growth mindset theory. So this is the belief that individuals believe their talents are not fixed and can be developed through hard work, those all important keystone habits, and input from others. Again, the growth mindset looks at how oftentimes we need to change the way we look at things. Everybody, I mean, I'm pessimistic. A lot of us can get into negative thoughts. We'll look at some of the thought traps later on, and so in hopes that we can move away from them. But mindset can be changed. Here are a couple cool things, the bullets on the right. So use the word yet. What does that suggest? That nothing's over, right? Failure is not finite. It's not the end, right? Vulnerability isn't the end. So instituting the word yet into our vernacular gives us control and it gives us more power over the end result. Acknowledge and embrace imperfections. Everybody knows, I mean, human beings, we're flawed. We know that. Replace the word failing with learning. That's the growth mindset to me in a nutshell. So we're not failing, we're learning. Another one here is stop seeking approval, because oftentimes grit is something that very rarely is developed outside of ourselves. We'll look at when. There is a culture of grit that we can surround ourselves with people who believe in the same things and sort of push us in a healthy way to succeed. But typically, grit comes from within. So giving other people the temperature check to see how we're feeling isn't necessarily the best route. And then finally, value the process over the end result. So while we're going through developing grit, or writing that research paper, or tackling that huge project at work, think about a sense of purpose while you're doing it. That's going to lessen the magnitude of the project or whatever it is that we're trying to tackle. So there is a grit self-assessment. I will put that in the chat, and you guys can take that for a minute before I send that over. There are no right or wrong answers. Answer honestly, considering how you see yourself and how you may compare to others. And your score reflects how passionate and persevering you see yourself to be. Again, this is a free quiz. You do not have to register. I'm going to send the link over in a second. If you look on the bottom left, I took the grit inventory before, and my score is here, good or bad. I just want you guys to be aware that it's not going to give you, sort of a prescription for success. It's really just going to give you a baseline. The hard work comes later on with developing grit. So I'll send that scale over, and if you guys are interested, we can just take a minute here and give that a shot. Again, this is the grit self-assessment quiz. There's no right or wrong answers. I've put the link in the chat. Answer honestly, and this will give you an idea of where your level of grit currently sits. And what we know too is with Dr. Dweck's research, the growth mindset is, whatever number comes up, it doesn't have to be that. It can always develop. Okay. So let's move forward. So looking at failure and success with regard to grit. So new pathways, again, this is that sort of the mindset that can be developed throughout this. Fear of failure can stop us from trying. We all know that this is a very real dynamic. Many times, each of us has been confounded by something and just haven't tried because we feel that we're going to fail. But with grit, we have to look at this by consider trying something with the idea that any failure can be used to measure success. So even if we don't do well at something, it's a baseline. It's a first try. It's something that we build upon. It's sort of a foundation. So can success be measured if you've never experienced failure? Typically, I would say no. But what we want to look at too is what we learn from failure scaffolds future success. So whatever it is that we haven't learned or haven't done well, with that effort piece and the long-term persistence and passion that we may have for certain goals, it pays off. It takes time to develop, as we said, but the perceived failure allows us to move forward. And it's sort of helpful. So think about failure as helpful. It's kind of a strange statement, but I think it can hold out. Share failure as a way to create a normalizing culture. So this is where grit doesn't come from within 100% of the time. You can create what they call a culture of grit. So a culture of grit can lead both individuals and groups to greater success. And this can be both personally as well as professionally. So there are corporations, organizations, nonprofits, mom and pops, organizations in general that sort of bring one another to a different level in a good way. So there are challenges, there's respect, there is inclusion. There's a number of different pieces there. And what I think is cool too is having this culture of grit means you're not alone. And that can make that big piece about vulnerability a little bit less daunting. Again, with failure and success, these are the things you want to look out for. So we looked at what grit is, how to develop it, the growth mindset, but throughout this process, we're going to run into these things. So that's what they're calling them, thinking traps. So first one there is jumping to conclusions. So making assumptions without relevant data. Tunnel vision, seeing only the negative perspective. Certainly not helpful when trying to develop grit. And Dr. Duckworth used this phrase quite a bit in her TED talk that I mentioned earlier. She said, life isn't a sprint, it's a marathon. So that's okay. It's sort of like there can be failures along the way, but as we supersede them, then we, get closer to success. Other thinking traps, magnifying and minimizing. How often do we do this? So overvaluing and undervaluing events that have occurred. So throughout the day, throughout the week, something has come up, and then we ruminate. We think about it, we think on it, and it's just sort of festers. It's a negative thought that informs how we move forward. So when you do any of these sort of thinking traps, so try and stop yourself, because it's the growth mindset that's not allowed to be part of the program. And we want that to be part of our future thoughts. So personalizing, last one here, attributing problems to oneself. So I blew it. I just don't have the talent. I don't have the skills. That sort of thing prohibits us from getting into this grit culture. Other thinking traps, again, these are things we want to look out for. Externalizing. So that's the opposite of the last one. So a tendency to attribute problems to others. No, it's not me, it's them. That's whatever it is that's going down, it's not my fault. It has to be them. Overgeneralizing, another thinking trap, using always and everything explanations about oneself or one's environment. So this is akin to catastrophizing in some respects. So when we say this to ourselves, I'm always, or this always, or everything, it's sort of just such a blanket statement that covers everything that's not true. The world is way too complex to have sort of everything be covered in one comment, one perspective. Mind reading, another thinking trap. We know what those, we fall into this sort of thing. We know what those are around us are thinking and the rationale behind their behavior. We may have an inkling, but we don't really know what's going on in people's heads. Emotional reasoning, drawing false conclusions about the world based on our emotions. So um, some of the research suggests emotional flooding can occur and get in the way of our rational thought. And when that happens, again, it sort of puts a wrench into the whole works. So again, with the strength and vulnerability, that's sort of a really strange way to look at it, but an interesting thing to spend some time to think about. So vulnerability is, in this whole look, a good thing. So it's key to developing healthy relationships. But who wants to be vulnerable in a relationship? You're supposed to be, stand up for yourself, be there for your partner, um, not be weak, but be supportive. But when you're vulnerable, um, you're open to a number of different things, whether they're attacks from others, or it gets fairly complex. But the whole piece with vulnerability here is that it allows us to see the world in a different way. It's not a bad thing to be vulnerable. Overcoming failure, engaging in innovation. So to be vulnerable, this is sort of when people and the releasing creativity, those last two bullets, it's sort of like when you're spitballing ideas, the brainstorming. That's a great place to be vulnerable. Let's see. So again, strength and vulnerability. This is a paradoxical state where conventionally weak state of mind makes us stronger. So some of the rationale there is it's okay not to know everything, and it can be liberating to believe in all that. Where I don't need to know everything. I can say to somebody, I don't know. I'm not sure. Those are sort of strong statements. It shows vulnerability, and it shows that you're being genuine. Help seeking behavior should be applauded. It's okay to need help. I know sometimes in our culture, you have to know everything. You don't need help from anybody. Um, but internally, developing grit allows us to sort of help others as well as, help ourselves. And then again, that final piece, their vulnerability actually makes us grittier, which is crazy to think about. So some final quotes on failure and grit. I love this first one. The real test is not whether you avoid failure, because you won't. It's whether you let it harden or shame you into inaction, or whether you learn from it, whether you choose to persevere. So President Barack Obama. So, I mean, what is echoed in that quote that we've looked at? Failure, grit, perseverance, learning from failure, taking negative things, turning them into positive things. It's all in that one quote alone. Failure is not falling down, but refusing to get up. So that's recognizing that failure is, definitely something negative. But this one has to do with, yeah, you get knocked down, but you got to get back up, and you got to get back up for the long term. Third quote: do not judge me by my successes. Judge me by how many times I fell down and got back up again. Nelson Mandela. So again, these are most of these quotes probably occurred. The Barack Obama, he was on point. He was president during that time when grit theory and growth mindset came out. But it's a universal feeling to feel knocked down and to have to get back up. And the backbone of grit is to persevere, to have stamina. It's not a sprint, it's a marathon. Success is not final. Failure is not fatal. It's the courage to continue that counts. Boom, grit, backbone, to continue, to persevere. And then the last one by J.K. Rowling, failure is so important. What a statement. Most of us run from failure. We do our best to stay away from it. But she's saying it's important. We speak about success all the time. It's the ability to resist failure or use failure that often leads to greater success. So Harry Potter seemingly was onto grit well before most folks. So going forward, a couple tips to finish things off here. Again, the growth mindset, try and keep that at the forefront, that we are a blank page, free to develop. We're not static or fixed. Our talents are not inert. They can be developed. There's a whole, side of science called neuroplasticity, where we can further develop our minds, and certainly increase our ability to do things. Here too, we want to check our ego at the door, and it's okay to be vulnerable because vulnerability is seen as a strength, and of course, embracing failure. We looked with Keystone Habits, keeping a journal. Journaling can increase grittiness. It fosters accountability. That goes to the Keystone Habit of, as I mentioned, keeping a food log, while you're exercising, something like that. But also too, with that Keystone Habit of having a morning routine. So planning out our day, that sort of journaling or, whatever time management device you use can be incredibly helpful. Practicing grit. So you want to target grit development through practice and patience. We looked at this earlier, how, it all sounds good during the presentation and on paper or whatever, but to do it that's the marathon. That's the tough part. Keystone Habits, as much as 40% of our day relies on habits, not decisions. So we looked at those Keystone Habits and how they spill over into other portions of our lives. And I love that idea because the world is so complex and things are so difficult. Establishing a few Keystone Habits that are positive affects so many others just because they exist. And then finally, thinking traps. We looked at those. If you find yourself unnecessarily magnifying or minimizing events, personalizing things, externalizing things, that sort of mindset puts you, at the opposite of what this theory is suggesting, which is the growth mindset, to be open to these things. So that concludes the formal presentation itself. If you have any questions or thoughts, by all means, you can type them into the chat. And Joseph, if you want to take over and provide the QR code for those who would like to scan for the suitable app, by all means.
Sure. Thank you, Adam. Hello, everyone. I see some familiar faces here. I see Sierra, Gianna. I feel like I've been seeing you the entire week. I hope everyone's doing well. Let me just share my screen. Here you go. Here's the suitable QR code. If anyone is unable to scan it for whatever reason, you could just message me in the chat and I'll be sure to manually add you. I know Sierra she's on her phone, so she's not able to scan the QR code. So if you are having trouble, just message me and I'll add you manually after this webinar.
Thank you, Joseph. We do have one question, or comment rather, from Rudy. He's indicating, if you're on a path that you face with grit and perseverance, how do you know when failure is a sign to choose a different path, or if failure is a temporary sign of heading in the right direction? I love that. That's deep. That's huge. If I took the second half, failure is a temporary sign, that piece sort of speaks to grit to me, because failure is never finite, right? There is no one exit in this marathon. We're just going to continue on. So here too, I would look at my gut. So much of this is about a growth mindset. It's about looking at thinking traps and avoiding them. So much of this is cerebral. And I think we can get in trouble if we overthink this stuff. But the other side is that sort of intuitive thing. You don't know why something's going to happen, or you don't know if that's a temporary sign or not. Check your gut. What is your intuition telling you? Is that temporary, and is that something I can move through and move past? I would be likely to ask myself that. But great question. Other questions or thoughts? Another great question. Absolutely, Christian. So, how do you snap out of the thinking traps once you become self-aware of them mentally? I think that you've sort of answered it. The biggest thing with these thought traps, these thinking traps, is that we just let them go. It's like autopilot, right? We just let that externalizing or personalizing or minimizing or magnifying thought trap continue. But as soon as you recognize it, once you become aware of them mentally, that's half the game, because you know it's going on and you can begin to put on the brakes. Great question. Other thoughts, comments? As these questions or comments come in, just to reiterate, I will follow up with you either the end of today or tomorrow with the link for this presentation, along with the evaluation of this webinar. Again, that's super fast. I've seen people finish it in less than a minute. It's very brief, and it is anonymous. And then the third piece in that email will be the RSVP link to the virtual career fair in Montclair State, April 21st. That's a Wednesday at 2:30. Okay. I don't see any other questions at this point. Um, Joseph, anything else? Any final thoughts?
Um, yeah, I want to thank everyone for coming out. I feel like grit is definitely something we need today, especially with everything that's been going on in the country and around the world. And thank you for coming out, guys. Just be sure to check out our Engage page for Center for Leadership and Engagement and Center for Career Services for any upcoming workshops for the rest of the semester. Other than that, that's all I have. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming out.
Awesome. Thanks, Joseph. Everyone have a great rest of the week. I know we're on Thursday here. You're almost done. Be safe, stay safe, and hopefully we'll all get back onto campus in the soon future. Take care.